Is it? I was waiting for it. Okay. So we were in the regulatory framework for RBI. The RBI is being authorized by the with the insertion of Chapter 3B that we were seeing in the RBI Act. RBI got the power to regulate NBFCs and issue direction for NBFCs. Earlier, RBI used to issue this master circular on every 1st of July, which would consolidate all the circulars that the RBI is issuing during the year, and that would be consolidated in this one particular master circular, which we used to refer as a one-point access for all the directions that is applicable on the NBFCs. But later on, from 2016 onwards, master directions are being issued. So master direction, the idea of master direction is actually that all the regulations, which is for a particular maybe type of NBFC or on a particular category of regulations, they are being compiled in one place in under the master directions itself. The master directions that we'll see over here is for different categories of NBFCs. I'll just share the PPT also so that it will be easier for us to. So for each subject matter, all the instructions that the RBI is issuing, it is there in this master direction. Any updates or amendments that is coming, it may be issued by way of a notification or a circular, and it gets incorporated in the master direction itself. The master direction clearly says that the existing master circulars that were there, they don't apply now. They stand withdrawn with the issue of these master directions. The list of master directions, I've tried to list out the principal directions that are there for the major types of NBFCs that we have. We have the deposit taking NBFCs, which are governed by the master direction on non-banking acceptance of deposit. Then we have systemically important non-deposit taking NBFCs, non-systemically important non-deposit taking NBFCs, and CICs. So these are the four main directions, principal directions, you can say. The major types of NBFCs are getting covered over here. A deposit taking NBFC has to follow both these master direction, which is for non-banking financial company acceptance of deposit, as well as the non-banking financial company systemically important non-deposit taking and deposit taking company. We'll, for the purpose of today's webinar, we'll be focusing on NBFC NDSI regulations, which is systemically important NBFC. Apart from this principal master direction, we have several other master directions also, which are being issued, like the master direction for monitoring of fraud, the master direction for information IT framework for the NBFC, for returns, for auditors report. These are specific and are applicable on all NBFCs. The master direction monitoring of fraud is applicable only for systemically important. Apart from that, the IT framework, the returns and auditors, these are applicable on all NBFCs, be it a systemically important or non-systemically important. Let us get into the contents of these master direction, the major contents of the master direction over here. The master direction for systemically important companies that we'll be covering. Mainly, what is it that is important over here to see is the capital requirement, prudential regulations, fair practice code, corporate governance, acquisition and transfer of control. If I have to sum up, these are the key areas of concern which will be important for discussion over here, and to understand what is it that is there inside these regulations. Apart from the chapters, there are also several other annexures. These are event specific. Why do I say event specific? Because it is not applicable just by the fact that you become a systemically important NBFCs. These guidelines are applicable only in case you are entering into such transactions or you breach that particular threshold that has been prescribed. For example, the LRM framework, which is Liquidity Risk Management Framework, recently introduced, that is applicable only in case you are a type 1 NBFC with an asset size of more than 100 crores. Next, the guidelines on securitization transaction is only applicable on you, or you have to follow that only in case you are entering into securitization or direct assignment transactions. The norms on restructuring, ombudsman scheme, the applicability, all of these are applicable, are event specific. Fit and proper obviously is on all, so it has to be, it comes from the corporate governance, so it will be applicable on all systemically important NBFCs. Coming to the applicability, what we can do is segregate the applicability based on whether the NBFC is having any customer interface and access to public funds or not. So by the term customer interface, what do I mean? An NBFC will have customer interface not while it's involved only in investment transaction, but if it is lending to customers at large or to public at large. So in case the NBFC is into lending, it will have customer interface and public funds, as my colleague was discussing about the public funds. If the NBFC is having access to public funds, which is the outside fund in the way of bank borrowing or commercial paper issuance, debenture issuance, intercorporate deposit, any of these, then that will be the company will be said to have access to public funds. Over here, public funds are also including issuance of guarantees. In case I'm having any sort of guarantee issued, then I'll not get the exemption. So what is the exemption is that if I have customer interface and public funds, the entire direction is applicable on me. However, if I don't have customer interface and access to public funds, the entire direction is applicable except some parts. The except some parts are the FPC norms. FPC is fair practice code, which is applicable only in case I'm having any customer interface. So the relevant chapter 6 dealing with FPC will not be applicable on me. Then the KYC directions, which is dealt in para 84, will also not be applicable. Registration with CICs, 4 CICs that I have to register with as an NBFC, that is also not applicable, covered in para 100. It is not applicable if the company is purely into investment and not having any customer interface. The LRM framework, as I mentioned, is only applicable in case you are not a type 1 NBFC, and type 1 NBFC does not have customer interface and access to public funds. So these are the also para 23, which deals with concentration norms. So there is a proviso to the concentration norms which says that in case you're not having any customer interface and access to public funds, that is, you're not issuing guarantees also, in that case you will not be required to comply with the concentration norms. We'll discuss what is concentration norms in detail later on. Next, in case I have customer interface, but I don't have customer interface, but I have access to public funds, then in that case, the entire direction is applicable except the FPC, because FPC comes only when I have customer interface. Para 84, which is again KYC, 100 is registration with CICs. And in case I have customer interface, but I don't have public funds, then para 23, which is the concentration norms, will not be applicable on me. So now moving ahead, the first most important thing for an NBFC SI, that is capital requirement. When I say capital requirement, what do I actually mean is that being a large NBFC, so an SI is a NBFC having asset size of more than 500 crores. So with such a quantum and such a huge balance sheet, it is very likely that it will have to manage its loans, advances, its assets in such a way that it has adequate capital so as to manage the risk associated with the assets on its balance sheet as well as off balance sheet. So what RBI requires these NBFCs to do is that they have to maintain certain minimum capital ratio. Capital ratio, as you can see on the screen as well, the computation of capital ratio is done by dividing tier 1 and tier 2 capital by the aggregate risk weighted assets. So what happens is that since NBFCs is involved in money lending activities and it is a risky business, loans are risky as we all know. So what we do is the assets that are there on the books, we multiply those assets with a risk percentage that has been prescribed by the RBI itself. The percentage weights have been given. So we multiply the value of the on-balance sheet assets and the nominal value of, in case of on-balance sheet, it is multiplied by the on-balance sheet value, the risk weights. In case of off-balance sheet assets, what we do is the nominal value, we multiply it with the credit conversion factor that is given, and then it is converted into the risk weight, and we determine the amount. Against this risk-weighted average, aggregate risk-weighted assets, I have to maintain a particular capital, That is at least 15 times. It should not be less than 15 times that I have maintained my capital. The capital is in again divided into two parts, by tier 1 capital and tier 2 capital. Tier 1 capital is actually nothing but my own funds. Own funds, as we all know, is the owner's own equity, that is paid up equity capital. If it is preference shares that are compulsory convertible into equity, those are included over there. Then in case there are free reserves, that is included, the PL balance. So these are the components which make up my own fund. I have to reduce something from my own fund to derive at the NOF or my tier 1 capital. The reduction is any investment that I do in shares of other non-banking financial companies. So in case it is an investment in other NBFC, that has to be reduced in excess of 10% of my own fund, as well as in case there are investments in shares, debenture, or any lending, loans, or advances that I've given to my companies in the same group. So companies in the same group is again defined, the subsidiaries and companies in the same group. In excess of 10%, if there is anything that I have invested or given a loan to them, that has to be reduced from my own fund to get the net own fund. Perpetual debt instruments are also allowed to be considered as tier 1 capital to the extent they are not in excess of 15% of the entire tier 1 capital. So this tier 1 capital, we understand, is actually owners, who is the owner of the NBFC, his own funds over here. This has to be maintained at least 15 times of the aggregate paid up capital. I have to maintain tier 1 capital at least 10%. And both tier 1 and tier 2 in aggregate has to be at least 15%. Tier 2 capital includes the following: preference shares, revaluation
Anita?
reserves, the general.
So just before, so I'm just,
Yeah, sure.
yeah, I'm just intervening in the, before you start talking about tier 2 capital. So I think there's one thing we need to understand over here is that why do we have to reduce the investment in other NBFCs and share investments in group companies to arrive at tier 1 capital? Now the concept is such that, say for example, I'll just take an example to explain this to you. So we have an NBFC, right? So the NBFC has a capital of say 15 rupees. Now, as per the capital adequacy norms, the maximum that I can borrow is 85 rupees. Because since if we back calculate it from my from the total assets, then 15 rupees is my capital. Then therefore, the maximum that I can have as borrowing is 85 rupees. So I've gone ahead and borrowed 85 rupees. So now I have a total assets of 100 rupees. Now I am deploying that entire 100 rupees in one of my subsidiaries, right, which may or may not be a financial institution, right? Now this 100 rupees now becomes the capital of my subsidiary, and the subsidiary will now leverage this 100 rupees and raise further funds from the market. So what is happening over here is we are there is a concept, there is a case of multiple leveraging of funds. So my actual equity in the total group is 15 rupees, but based on that I am raising funds to the extent of say if the downstream entity is also a NBFC, it can also again borrow another say around 600 crores of borrowings it can easily carry out. So with a capital infusion of 15 rupees, I am borrowing to the tune of 700 rupees. So to avoid such a situation, they have brought in the concept, and they ask, so they have provided that if you have made investments in the group companies, then it should be reduced to the extent it exceeds 10%. Up to 10% it is acceptable. The moment you invest more than 10%, it has to be reduced from your own funds, so that there's no, you cannot leverage it multiple times, right? So Anita, you can now go ahead.
Yeah, and that is the reason, like my colleague said, that is the reason that in case these investments are reduced from the calculation of own fund to that extent, the concentration norms are not applicable on them. We'll discuss the concentration norms also next. Before that, let us just see what is there in tier 2 capital. As you can see the list over here, the preference shares other than which are compulsorily convertible. So these are not the owner's own equity or own funds, but yeah, these are also considered as my tier 2 capital. The general provisions that I create, the provisions for standard assets, hybrid debt, capital instruments, subordinated debt, those that I'm issuing. Okay, now the Next important topic over here, which will require a bit of a discussion, is the prudential norms. I'll divide the prudential norms into three parts: asset classification, income recognition, and provisioning. By asset classification, what do I mean? My loans, my lease, my hire purchase assets, any form of credit, I have to classify them into 4 categories. What are these categories? First, I come to standard asset. As the name suggests, standard asset means that there is no default or no delinquency in this particular asset, and there is no risk attached to it, any additional risk or any apart from the normal risk that we have for lending. There's no sign of risk or stress attached to this particular asset. Then it is classified as a standard asset. Once there is a default, so by default, if there is a non-payment, I classify an asset as an NPA once there is a default and the default continues for 3 months. So if 30th of, so say, we'll take an example, 1st January was my due date for payment and I did not pay on that day. So, and I continue to the default till 31st of March. So after 3 months, as on 31st March, this particular asset will be considered as a NPA, non-performing asset. NPA now has 3 subcategories that are substandard, doubtful, and loss. So a substandard asset is one which stays as an NPA for a period not exceeding 12 months. So from that 31st March that I classified my asset as an NPA, it will remain as a substandard asset till the next 31st March, that is for a period of 1 year. So for that 1 year, I'm considering that asset as a substandard asset. After that, the classification will change, because doubtful asset, the definition says that doubtful asset is an asset which stays as substandard for a period exceeding 12 months. So then after the 12-month, the 31st March, after substandard, it will be classified as a doubtful asset for a period exceeding 12 months. That is, that stayed as substandard. A loss asset is an asset which either I classify, during the inspection, RBI has told me that there is no, you should write this asset off. Loss asset is usually written off, or I provide 100% for that. So either during the inspection, or I identify such an asset as there is no possibility of recovery, or the value of security that was associated with that particular asset has reduced to such extent that I'll not be able to recover that. So in that circumstance, I classify the asset as a loss asset. So this is the classification that we do for standard, substandard, doubtful, and loss asset. Once we do the classification, we are also required to do provisioning for them. So the provisioning for a standard asset is 0.4%. For a substandard, it is 10%. For a doubtful asset, it depends whether it is unsecured or secured. For the unsecured portion, I have to provide 100%. For the secured portion, it will depend on which year of classification it is. So if it is the first year of classification, it is 20%, second 30%, and third year onwards, it is 50%. A loss asset, as mentioned, has to be written off completely or provided 100%. Substandard asset is also an asset once I do any sort of restructuring or something, the classification of the asset from standard changes to substandard, and it continues till it shows 1 year of satisfactory performance from the date the restructuring was done. So the restructured terms, in case satisfactory performance has been shown on such restructured terms, then it will again be, the category can be changed. Otherwise, it will remain as a substandard asset. How do I do the income recognition on these assets? For a standard asset, income recognition is done on accrual basis. So based on the due dates of my EMI payments or interest payment, I'll recognize the income. However, for NPA, the income recognition is done on cash or recovery basis. And in case for an NPA asset, if I've already recognized an income in my books, I'll have to reverse it once it becomes an NPA, because it is only on cash or recovery basis that I'll do the income recognition. So this is the concept of asset classification, income recognition, and provisioning norms. Next, the another important concept that we'll delve into is the concentration norms. As we were mentioning while calculation of the own funds, that any investments that I do in other NBFCs or any investments in shares, bonds, and loans that I give to my group companies, to the extent it is in till 10%, it is to the extent it is more than 10%, I reduce it from the own funds calculation to drive at my NOF. in case, so that particular part, to the extent I have reduced it from my own funds calculation, I'll not have to follow the concentration norm for them. Apart from that, for all other lendings and investment that I do to any single borrower, if I'm lending or if I'm investing in the shares of any company, on a single basis, I cannot do more than 15% of my own fund. And if it is considered on a group basis, a single group of borrower or group of companies on to whom I'm lending or I'm investing in the shares, it cannot exceed 25% of my own funds. And if I have to, and I also have to see that my lending as well as investment on aggregate together shall not exceed 25% in case of a single party and 40% in case of a group of parties. Now, what happens if I exceed these concentration limits? So the concentration limits in case have been exceeded is a breach of the RBI regulations. There is no such provision to provide that the you'll have to reduce it from your tier 1 capital or you have to provide for it. It is only that in case the concentration norms are breached, then it is a breach of the RBI regulations and the applicable monetary penalty or anything, the action that the RBI might take will be applicable on the company then in that case.
Anita, before you move on to the next slide, Anita.
Yeah.
Yeah, just go back to the concentration norms. Yeah. So we just saw that what are the different concentration norms that have been provided by RBI, but we need to also, see what was the intention of introducing this concentration norms. So concentration norms, by concentration norms, it reminds me of a very old proverb which says, do not put all your eggs in one single basket. So if I invest a lot of my funds, if I block a lot of my funds in one single entity, and if that entity fails, that would have a huge impact on my own balance sheet. So therefore, to diversify the risk in my business, RBI says that you should limit your exposure to one particular entity, and you should diversify your risk. You should diversify your portfolio such that if that entity falls, it does not lead to a multiplier effect on your business and you are completely safe. So this is what the intention of concentration norms. Now, Anita, you can now move ahead.
Yeah. Moving ahead is the fair practice code. So when I say fair practice code, it might seem like this is very theoretical, that I have to deal with a code that is just laying down principles as to how your lending practices should be, that you should be fair enough in dealing with the public at large, and your lending practices should be fair enough, and there must be adequate disclosure and everything. So though these seem to be very theoretical, but however, we have seen in the past also that RBI has been very particular about the compliance with the FPC. It has been imposing penalty of more than 5 crore and several, maybe the quantum is not important, but yeah, a hefty penalty is imposed in case of non-compliance of the fair practice code. So, and hence, even if it is theoretical, it becomes important to abide by the fair practice code and the regulations that is laid over there. Briefly, what exactly the fair practice code says is that most of the points, I'll discuss the points wherein it is seen that usually NBFCs are missing these points. That is one being the disclosure of interest rate. So nowadays, mostly most of the fintech NBFCs, newer NBFCs, they are charging rate of interest based on monthly rate of interest. So they are not disclosing the annualized rate of interest, wherein the requirement is specifically there that you have to mention or disclose the annualized rate of interest while dealing with the customer. So in the loan application form, in the agreement, everywhere, the annualized rate of interest must be given. The logic behind it is that it is easier for the customer also to compare it with the other lenders. So if I maintain a standard that yes, it will be annualized rate of interest for all these loans, so it will be easier for the customer also to decide that from where should I take the loan, or to compare it. Second, another thing is that while doing the loan application form, there is a requirement that if I'm charging different rate of interest from the customers, so there is a possibility that based on the risk of a customer, how risky a customer is, based on the background financial statements of the customer, the credit score of the customer, the industry from where the customer belongs, I may classify the customer into different risk buckets, and based on those risk buckets, I might charge different rate of interest from different customers. So that has to be clearly laid down, and that has to be mentioned in the loan application form itself, that yes, there are criteria of doing different, of charging different rate of interest and doing different gradation of risk, and based on that, I'll charge different rate of interest from such and such customers. There's also a requirement to give acknowledgement of the loan application form. The grievance redressal mechanism, this is also a part of the FPC. I have to have in place a grievance redressal mechanism, wherein I'll have to appoint a grievance redressal officer whose name and address and contact details must be mentioned and be available at everywhere in the premises of the NBFC, even in the branch offices. The language and mode of communication. Another important thing over here is that loan agreements, we will see that usually it is English that we prefer to draft our loan agreements and share it with our customers. The RBI has said that the loan agreements must be in a vernacular language or a language as understood by the borrower. So the compliance can be easily ensured in a way that if we take a confirmation from the borrower or an undertaking from the borrower that yes, he understands English as a language, as a mode of communication, and based on that, he's signing this agreement. This is a simple declaration or undertaking that can be taken, and I can do all my communication with him in English. The fair practice code, the medium of displaying my fair practice code, also the language and mode has to be in all vernacular language. So you'll see most of the larger NBFCs, or since fair practice code has to be published on the website, what they do is that they publish the fair practice code not just in English but also in the language in this the vernacular language of the states in which they are dealing with. So the fair practice code in all such languages displayed on the website of the company. Apart from this, the repossession clause that has to be, you cannot be very coercive in your repossession mechanism and everything. So in case of secured lending, this has to be ensured that the repossession clause is not very coercive, and it is the customer, no undue advantage is taken for the customer. So I have to ensure this fair practice not just in my marketing, on my lending side, on my servicing side, but also collection. There are 4 aspects wherein the fair practice code has to be ensured throughout the process, starting from marketing to lending to servicing as well as collection. I think almost most of the major parts have been covered. There's also a requirement that the penalty amount must be disclosed in bold in the loan agreement. So these are several minute, you can say, considerations that has to be made sure that you ensure that these are in place so as to avoid any non-compliance with the fair practice. Next, corporate governance. The fair practice code was applicable on you even if you were an NSI, that is a non-systemically important NBFC. The corporate governance becomes applicable only once you become a SI. Corporate governance actually comes from the Companies Act itself. So how you should be governing the operations of a company, and it should be a true and fair view should be given, and how you will be ascertaining whosoever is becoming a director, the fit and proper criteria of the director, and several other disclosure requirements. So based the corporate governance framework for an NBFC includes formation of several committees like the audit committee, nomination and remuneration committee. These all committees, audit committee and nomination committee, is there in the Companies Act itself. So if the company has already constituted these committees in compliance with the Companies Act, the same shall be compliance of the RBI regulations as well. Over here also, though the requirement has been laid that yes, you have to constitute this committee, however, the powers of that committee, the terms of reference of that committee, what are the functions of that committee, is to be referred from the Companies Act itself. 2 other committees are the Risk Management Committee and ALM Committee. These committees are applicable on an NBFC once it crosses the asset size of 100 crores. It is not just for an SI, but once an NBFC crosses the asset size of 100 crores and it is not a type 1 NBFC, then in that case, the LRM framework becomes applicable, and from there, the ALM Committee and the Risk Management Committee is to be constituted. the appointment of CRO. So the appointment of CRO is also not applicable just by the fact that you are an NBFC SI. It is only when the asset size of the company is more than 5,000 crores. So it is only the larger NBFCs who will require a chief risk officer to be appointed, who will look after the credit products, who will in the decision making of any credit product, what are the risks associated with such credit product. They will the main duties of a CRO is to act independently in identifying the risk, measuring the risk, and mitigating the risk associated with any credit product. So they are involved in the decision making stage as well. Their reporting is also directly to the board or the committee, risk management committee. I have to frame a policy to ascertain the fit and proper criteria of my directors. So the fit and proper criteria of my directors, directors of an NBFC who are dealing with the operations of an NBFC, it must be ensured that they possess the requisite qualification and knowledge to handle the business operations of an NBFC. So before appointing any director, I'll have to ascertain whether he's fit and proper for it, the relevant experience in this, in either the banking sector or a non-banking sector, and knowledge or other relevant knowledge that he brings across the board. So all these, if you'll see, is something that is related to the corporate governance that we have already, we know from the Companies Act and the SEBI LODR as well. Next coming is that the declaration of an obtaining a declaration and undertaking along with the deed of covenants. This is also procedural that I have to take from all my directors at the time of appointment and reappointment. There is the concept of transfer of control that we'll be dealing with. Over there also, I have to take these declarations and undertaking and submit it to the RBI and obtain the prior approval from RBI before I'm appointing a director in certain cases. So I'll discuss that just after this. I'll just complete this. There's also a requirement I have to submit a statement on change of directors and a certificate from the MD confirming that the compliance of the fit and proper criteria. This has to be certified by the auditor for the last quarter. Annual disclosures are there, and I have to frame this corporate governance framework, the guidelines, internal guidelines on corporate governance. This has to be in place. Acquisition and transfer of control. Like I was mentioning in the earlier slide, that there are certain cases wherein prior approval from RBI is required. What are those cases? In case of takeover or acquisition of control of an NBFC, which may or may not result in change in management. So there are three, I've divided this into three parts. One is takeover or acquisition of control. For the definition of takeover and acquisition of control, I'll have to refer the SEBI SAST regulations, which define control as the power to appoint, the right to appoint a majority of director or to control the management. So this may not just be by virtue of change in any shareholding. I'm acquiring a major shareholding of the company, but it can be by virtue of any management rights or any agreements or any other manner, directly or indirectly. If I am acquiring any sort of takeover or I'm acquiring the control of that NBFC, then that will require the prior approval from RBI. Next, change in the shareholding of an NBFC, which would result in acquisition, transfer of shareholding of 26% or more of the capital. Over here, what is important? So there are several times most of the queries that come from here is that whether this will, how are we going to? So I'll just take a few examples so as to maybe discuss this. What happens is this calculation of 26%. Do I have to take it on a single acquisition basis, or it can be a creeping acquisition as well? So the idea is that if there is any change in the shareholding, it can even be a creeping acquisition, that is over a period of time that I've taken. First, I took 10% of the shares of a company, of an NBFC. At that time, the prior approval was not required. Next, I'm taking 16%. So in aggregate, 10 plus 16, I'm breaching this requirement of 26%. So in that case, the prior approval will be required the second time when I'm acquiring 16%. There can also be a case that the company is I already have significant control over the company. So I already own say 70% and the next person B is holding 30%. He transfers me that 26% from his share or the entire 30%. So I was already in control of the company. But however, the language says that if it is any change in shareholding, if it is more than 26%, I'll still require the prior approval. So the fact that I was already in control of the operation of the company does not matter. If there is a change, it can be a upward change or a downward change. I can acquire or I can give away. So in both the cases, I'll have to take the prior approval from RBI. In case I'm acquiring or transferring any my shareholding, which is 26% or more. In case of buyback or reduction, there is a specific exemption that in those cases, the prior approval will not be required. It is only the intimation that I have to send to RBI once the scheme is in place. For intra-group transfers also, the RBI FAQs have clearly said that for intra-group transfers, you will have to, on a case-to-case basis, you have to apply to the RBI, and maybe you will be granted exemption from the compliance, but you'll have to apply to the RBI. You'll be granted exemption on a case-to-case basis. It is subjective. Next, coming the shareholding. After the shareholding, another important thing where another situation where prior approval is required is change in management of the NBFC, which results in more than 30%. Over here, if my management consists of 3% and one person is retiring or has resigned, in that case, I need the prior approval from RBI, because more than 30%, there is a change in the management. This calculation will not include independent directors. So if my board has 5 directors, out of which 2 are independent directors, then I'll have to exclude those 2 so as to determine whether there is a change in management or not. This calculation of 30% is also not relevant in case of a death or any unforeseeable event for which prior approval cannot be taken, but yeah, intimation can be sent to the RBI. In case there is so these are the 3 situations wherein prior approval is required. I've discussed in these slides in detail over here. The prior approval in case of shareholding, it cannot be just one go, it can be cumulative as well, progressive transfer over a period of time. Preference shares will not have an impact because it is clearly said that it is paid up equity capital that has to be transferred. In that case, only the prior approval is required. And buyback and reduction of capital has to be approved by the competent court, and it is just an intimation that I have to send to RBI for this. And for change in management, also independent directors are excluded, and it does not cover re-election of directors subject to retirement by rotation. Next, moving ahead, is the liquidity risk management framework, which was recently introduced for NBFCs with an asset size of 100 crores. I've tried to cover
Anita?
what is.
Yeah. So
yes.
Just go back to the previous slide.
Yeah.
Before that, one more. Yeah. So Anita just mentioned that this is not applicable in case of in case the company is issuing preference shares, or the companies or anyone is acquiring preference shares. Now we need to understand that the whole intention is to ensure that the overall, so the equity capital does not go to someone's hand without RBI's supervision, because in effect the control will be shifted only by way of, usually if we see that control is shifted by way of transfer of equity shares. Now if let us take an example of convertible preference shares, where I'm giving an option to convert set of convert a set of preference shares into equity at a future date, or for example we are issuing compulsory convertible instruments, could be compulsory convertible debentures or compulsory convertible preference shares. Now what to do in that case? Now see, I cannot go ahead and issue convertible preference shares today, and at the time of conversion, then what if I take it to the RBI and RBI declines it? There's a possibility that I take the case in front of RBI at the time of conversion, and I place it in front of the RBI and say that I had issued convertible instrument 5 years back. Now the holder wants to exercise the option and wants to convert it into equity. So you give me approval. So RBI can simply decline it. Now what happens in such a situation? The investor, of course, the investor's interest would get jeopardized. So we suggest that whenever you are issuing any convertible instrument, be it preference shares or debentures, whether it is optionally convertible or compulsory convertible, to the extent possible, I think you should, take it to the RBI and have a word informally. In case you don't want to make a formal application, you can. So every entity has its own, zonal officer who takes care of all the matters of a particular entity. You can speak to your zonal officer and ask that whether this would require any prior approval or not, because it's always better to be on the compliant side before taking any drastic decisions. So our suggestion would be that whenever you're coming up with any issuance of any convertible security, you should speak to your RBI office and see if that would require a prior approval or not. Anita, now you can go ahead.
Yeah, so moving ahead, I was discussing the liquidity risk management framework that was recently introduced by the RBI for NBFCs with asset size more than 100 crores. The idea behind introducing a separate framework for managing liquidity risk was, as we all know, the collapse of DHFL and IFS. These were the instances which led to the which required the RBI to maybe introduce guidelines or specific framework to manage your liquidity risk. Sorry. What is it once this framework is in place? What is it that is required to be done? Is that the LRM I have to frame a policy for this, that what are the parameters that I'll be including over there, the concentration of funding, how is the funding to be ensured it is not concentrated in just from one source, and how I have to segregate it, the ALM mismatch that has to be ensured, that it cannot be that I'm availing the funds for short term and I'm giving it out on long term. Because if I'm availing the funds on short term, I have a liability to pay in short term, and if I give out, if I lend to others for long term, then I'll not be able to repay them at the time when the short term liability comes up. Bucketing, earlier the bucketing that was required to be done was minimum 31 to 30 days was a single bucket. This has now been done. The granular bucketing has been introduced. It is 1 to 7 days, 8 to 14 days, 15 to 30 days. The reason behind this granular bucketing is to ensure that my short-term liquidity is also tackled is also managed properly. So I'll have to see that my net cumulative negative mismatches are not exceeding 10% for a bucket of 1 to 7 days, and 10% for a bucket of 8 to 14 days, and for 15 to 30 days it is not exceeding 20% of the cumulative cash outflows. So that has to be ensured so that I can manage the mismatches if it is there in the cash flows. There is committee formation that we discussed already, ALM, ALCO, and there is an ALCO support group also that I have to form. Disclosure requirements are there, which have to be specifically provided in the quarterly returns, and it has to be published on the website as well. I have to also put in place a MIS system to provide timely and forward-looking information on the liquidity of the NBFC and the group. So the liquidity is not just under a stress condition, but also under normal conditions, whether I have sufficient liquidity or not. To ensure that there's another concept of liquidity coverage ratio that was introduced. This is, however, applicable only once you cross the asset size of 5,000 crores. In that case, you have to maintain this particular LCR, this liquidity coverage ratio, which is nothing but high quality liquid assets, how much I have to maintain as against my total net cash outflow over the next 30 calendar days. This the timelines for complying with this has also been prescribed for 5,000 and more 5,000 crore and more asset size company. It is, I think, 30% till from December 2020, and for more than 10,000 crore asset size, it is 50%. So I have to maintain high quality liquid assets. What are high quality liquid assets? These are liquid assets that can be readily or immediately converted into cash, and there is no loss of value or any collateral that is used. So they are unencumbered assets against the total net cash outflow that I intend to have over the next 30 calendar years. This has to be maintained as per the timelines provided in the framework. There are several other requirements also of the master direction that we are not dealing with in very detail, but I'll just briefly go over them. The requirement of having a policy in case you're extending demand and call loans. Demand and call loans are usually for a tenure. They have to be for a tenure of 1 year. If it is more than 1 year, then I have to specifically take the approval. The interest, take the internal committee. The interest on these loans have to be repaid on a monthly or a quarterly basis, and the principal can be on demand. Lending against gold, there are separate directions governing gold lending altogether. Against the security of shares also, if I'm lending. So several times what happens is that we get confused at what is lending against security of shares and a normal loan wherein I have taken a security of shares. So both of these are different, because if I'm lending against the security of shares, my loan, the amount of loan that I'm going to give you is dependent on the value of the security of that share. So in that case, the RBI directions become applicable and I have to maintain an LTV of 50%. But if I'm just giving a secured loan to you based on your customer, based on the profile of the customer, based on the credibility of the customer, I'm extending a loan, and to secure that, I'm taking maybe the property of the customer as security, or the shares of the customer as security. That is not lending against security of shares. That is just a secured lending. Norms for restructuring of advances. There is an annexure again specifically for restructuring of advances. While discussing moratorium, we'll discuss about restructuring again. Whether this moratorium, the relief that RBI has permitted the lenders to provide to the borrowers, whether this grant of moratorium will be considered as restructuring or not. Next, the information with respect to change of directors, address, auditors, these have to be intimated to RBI within 1 month from the date of occurrence. And there is the outsourcing guidelines also specifically introduced, wherein there are several aspects that we have to check. What are to be included in the outsourcing agreement, what sort of due diligence I have to do before appointing a service provider, and what all transaction. I can obviously not outsource my core management activities. Neither the compliance with the requirement of KYC can be outsourced. But apart from that, usually NBFCs do outsource their marketing function, or they appoint DSAs and collection agents. So these are included. They have to ensure that they comply with the outsourcing guidelines. Initially we discussed that what is the difference between a systemically important NBFC and a non-systemically important NBFC. What happens when a non-systemically important NBFC becomes a SI? So firstly, several times there are queries as to when do we decide that it has become a systemically important NBFC? Do we wait for the annual audited balance sheet of that company to see the asset size, or how do we determine that? So the RBI says that at any point of time, even during the financial year, you see that you have crossed the asset size of 500 crores, then you become an NBFC SI. As a systemically important NBFC, obviously, if I have to see that whether this company is systemically important NBFC or not, I look at the balance sheet. But a company which is already a non-systemically important NBFC, when will it start complying with the regulation that is applicable on a systemically important NBFC? The stage is whenever it crosses the asset size of 500 crores. So I'll not wait for the last audited balance sheet. I'll during the year also, if the asset size crosses 500 crore, the compliance with the regulations for systemically important will have to be ensured. What is the immediate actions that I have to take once I become a systemically important NBFC? There are certain committees that have to be formed. So the audit committee and the nomination committee, as we discussed, comes from the corporate governance norms, which is not applicable for a non-systemically important company. So those NBFCs who have just become systemically important by virtue of crossing the asset size of 500 crore will have to comply with the corporate governance norms and constitute these committees. From the IT framework also, which is a separate master direction, I have to form the IT strategy and IT steering committee. Chief risk officer, in case my asset size is more than 5,000 crores, I have to appoint a chief risk officer. This may not be an immediate action, since immediate action is only when it is crossing 500 crore, but once it crosses 5,000 crore, then I have to appoint chief risk officer. I have to obtain declarations and deed of covenant and the fit and proper criteria, which was also not there for the non-systemically important NBFC. So I have to, and thereafter, whenever there is any fresh appointment of director or reappointment, I have to ensure that these fair practice code and the corporate governance guidelines, fit and proper criteria is ensured, is complied with. The reporting requirements also from the next quarter, I have to state the reporting requirement which is applicable on a systemically important NBFC, that becomes applicable. And last but not the least, the various policies that I have to adopt. So dozens of policies that are listed by the NBFCs, that becomes applicable on me, and I have to be policy driven. So I have to formulate and adopt such policies for my company once I become systemically important. Coming to policies, I have listed down over here. Will not read these down, but yeah, these are the list of policies that are mandatorily required to be adopted by a systemically important NBFC as per the RBI guidelines. Several NBFCs appoint more than these policies as well. In case they're policy driven and they want everything to be on pen and paper, so there are policies apart from this also, which other NBFCs are formulating. In certain cases, there are also we also see that two or more of these policies are clubbed together in one particular policy itself, so as to ensure, because if there are two or more policies and the context of both the policies and the implementation has to be done by reading both of these in conjunction, then in that case it makes sense that yes, you combine both these policies and read it together. For example, like the credit policy can be combined along with the non-cooperative borrower, because in the credit policy I'll be laying down the categories of borrower that I'm intending to cater to, and if there is any non-cooperation or what is the condition that I can consider a borrower as non-cooperative, that will be listed there in the credit policy itself. The asset classification provisioning policy, several NBFCs do formulate this, but it is not required in case you're following the asset classification and provisioning requirement as is laid down in the RBI directions that we just discussed. So if my asset classification and provisioning is stricter than what the RBI has laid down, then maybe I'll require a separate policy. Otherwise, it is not required. Other policies some are based on the applicability, and others I'll have to anyways formulate and adopt. Next, coming to the reporting requirements. So these reporting requirements, the names are given over here. Now, since the XBRL format has come in place, the names of the returns have also recently changed. I've tried to list down the names. The ALM return, ALM 2 and 3, which was earlier separately submitted, it has been combined into one single form. CRILC reporting also, there is a difference with respect to CRILC reporting, which was quarterly and weekly done. We'll just discuss CRILC reporting in 2 slides later, wherein I'll just discuss the reporting to the various reporting agencies. So for the timing, let's not discuss CRILC reporting over here. Apart from that, the annual reporting and the quarterly reporting, these are mentioned over here. Due to the recently, due to the COVID disruption, RBI has also has allowed extension of timelines for reporting these for returns which are to be reported within 15 days. There is an extension of 30 days. By 30 days, it is getting extended, and which were to be reported within 10 days. There is an extension of another 10 days. So these are the reporting requirements. A snapshot of the applicability of various requirements that is applicable on an NBFC NDSI with public funds and without public funds is mentioned over here. Most of it we have discussed. Leverage ratio is not applicable in either case because it is coming from the NSI directions. Over there we have leverage requirement, and over here we have capital adequacy requirement. The intent is the same behind both these regulations. Moving ahead, dealing with information repositories, several of these agencies with whom I have to register or submit information. One of the main ones is the FIU IND. This requires registration of the reporting entity as well as my principal officer and the designated director. I have to report about them. I have to identify one person as a principal officer, designated director, and appoint them, and report the name and contact details of that person to the FIU. All of this is done online on the FIU IND portal. The purpose of getting registered with FIU IND is to report transactions with respect to cash transactions as well as suspicious transactions. All of these are coming from prevention of money laundering rules. In terms of those rules, I'll have to do the reporting as well. If I have any suspicious transaction that I come across, or if there is any cash transaction wherein forged notes have been used, or if it is cash transaction of more than 10 lakhs, so those have to be reported. Nil reporting is not required in this case. Several times there are cases wherein we think that we don't have any such suspicious transaction, but should we also report? But no, it has a clear notification is there that nil reporting is not required. In case you don't have anything to report, you may not report. The CKYC registry, central CKYC registry, the intention of introducing this was to have a centralized repository of KYC records of all the customers. So it is easier once a customer goes to a bank, submits all its KYC documents, and the bank does its due diligence and does the OSV, originally seen and verified, and everything. The bank can then upload those documents into this CKYCR repository. From there, the customer is allotted a unique identification number. And next time, if the customer comes to an NBFC, another bank, to obtain another loan, what I can do is get the information verified from this CKYCR registry itself. So I don't need to do the OSV again or go and get the documents physically, but based on the information that he has submitted to me and the unique code that he provides me with, based on that, I can verify the information from the records maintained over here in the CKYCR registry. Next is the NESL platform, which is the information that I have to submit over here with the NESL, information utility. This has been constituted under the IBC, wherein the provisions of IBC requires any financial creditor to submit financial information and information relating to assets in relation to which any security interest has been created in such form and manner as may be specified by the regulation. This came from the IBC. RBI has also specifically issued a notification in this regard, requiring NBFCs to comply with this and register themselves in the capacity of a financial creditor with the NESL platform to submit the financial information and information with respect to any security creation. Financial information, the list is very huge. So it is any record of debt of a person, record of liability when the person is solvent, assets and of persons over which security interest has been created. So all those details, in short, the loan details have to be submitted over here with the NESL platform. So any party connected to the debt, be it a creditor, co-applicant, co-borrower, guarantor, they are required to furnish this information to the IU. Next, the CRILC reporting that we were discussing. So CRILC reporting, the revised framework for stressed asset was introduced last year, I think in June. So based on that, there were changes in the reporting formats and the reporting. However, the reporting formats have not yet been notified. So earlier, the CRILC main, which was required to be submitted on a quarterly basis, right now it is monthly basis. Also, Earlier it was only SMA2 that required reporting. Now any SMA account has to be reported. However, in the absence of any utility being enabled, what the NBFCs are currently doing is they're not filing the weekly return, and they're continuing with the existing weekly report of SMA2 itself. Because the uh, revised guidelines require that on a weekly basis, every Friday, I have to file the details of all borrower, irrespective of the SMA status, who is having an exposure of more than 5 crore. So if a borrower is a borrower, all borrower entities who are having exposure of more than 500 crore, fund or non-fund based, the information of such borrowers have to be filed on a weekly basis. The classification as an SMA has also changed. Earlier, SMA classification was done based on any stress, if there is stress on an account, or if there is a likelihood that it will default based on that. But now it is on the basis of overdue itself. So once an account defaults, so for a period of 1 to 30 days, it will be SMA 0. From 31 to 60, it will be SMA 1, and 61 to 90, it will be SMA 2. So now the classification is based on default of that default that occurs with respect to a particular loan account. CICs, there are 4 CICs with whom all these NBFCs, apart from NBFCs which are purely into investment and who do not have any customer interface, I have to register with all 4 CICs while doing while lending to customers. The credit score that I check for the customers, I can avail from these CICs. And RBI requires that yes, you should your credit decision should be based on these credit score, CIBIL score that you obtain from the CICs, and also ensure that you are regularly reporting to all 4 CICs. The reporting formats and everything is to be decided as per the agreement that you enter into with the respective CICs. The SERSAI registration also, wherein all types of the RBI regulations requires that all types of mortgages have to be registered with the SERSAI, including equitable mortgage. But if I look into the SARFAESI Act, what it says is that no secured creditor will be able to enforce any security interest unless it has been registered with SERSAI. So in case I want to avail the benefits under the SARFAESI Act, I have to ensure all kinds of security interest. I'll have to register it with the SERSAI. If the any non-registration of the security interest would impact the right of enforcement under SARFAESI, the right of secured creditor under other laws such as IBC or common law will still be there, but under SARFAESI, this will be there will be an impact if it is not registered with SERSAI. Now I think Mr. Ghosh will take over for the
right. So before we start with the next section of the session, I would like to, I think this is the right time to pick up a few questions from the chat. There's been a lot of questions. So to start with, what I can say is definition of group to determine NBFCs in group. So this is a defined term. Let me just show you what the definition looks like. So it includes basically just a moment. Yeah. So companies in the group shall mean an arrangement involving 2 or more of the following relationships: subsidiary, parent, associate, joint venture, promoter, promotee. Promoter, promotee, in case of a listed company, the investee company should be a listed company. Otherwise, there is no question of going into the promoter promotee or determining the promoter promotee relationship. A related party as per AS 18, that would also include the corresponding standard as per Ind AS. Companies sharing common brand name and investment in equity shares of 20% or above. So this is what companies in the group mean. Now moving on to the next question. Right. So also when you say all companies in the group, does it also include overseas companies or no? So companies over here would mean companies registered in India and not your overseas group companies. Can we share the PPT? Okay, that's fine. We'll be anyway sharing the PPT. Question in moratorium. Abhishek, we will come back to it shortly. We will be discussing that separately. So we'll discuss that separately. Do we have to take uh, do we have to take annexure under fit and proper at the time of reappointment as well? Anita, would you like to answer that?
Yeah, because the requirement says that you have to take the for certain the fit and proper, you have to take the declarations and everything at the time of appointment and on a continuing basis. So usually the companies are taking it on an annual basis itself, and at
And
the
so
time of
even if it is, yeah,
reappointment as well,
right,
the declaration.
right,
Because
right,
reappointment is nothing but a appointment itself. So it includes.
right, agreed. RBI is Ashwin, RBI is asking for declaration and deed of covenants and fit and proper criteria even for directors. Yes, that is what we are also saying.
Yes.
In case if a company has 3 directors and they have appointed, they have to appoint one independent director, whether they would take the prior approval. No, independent directors have been excluded from the purview of change in management. So doesn't matter whether there's a retirement of independent director or there's an appointment of independent director, there is no question of seeking RBI approval. Does change in interest period from monthly to quarterly be considered as a restructuring? Okay, so restructuring basically means whenever I am modifying the terms of a contract so as to provide relief to the borrower, which assumed to face financial or economic difficulties. So the borrower should be in a position that it is facing financial or economic difficulties, and I am agreeing to the modification of terms only to provide a relief to the borrower. If until unless this entire this entire situation comes into picture, there is no question of restructuring, and we will also discuss this once we start discussing about the moratorium. So no, if there is no financial distress involved, then the answer to your question is no. What is the duration of considering change in directors of the company? Suppose I need to appoint one director at one board meeting and resign one director in next board meeting, whether approval of RBI is required for the same and deed of covenant required for reappointment. Answer is yes. So whenever there is a change, you will have to determine, doesn't matter whether it's, even if it is like within a span of 1 day or 1 month or 1 year, doesn't matter. Every time there is a change, you will have to see if that tantamounts to change of 30% of the composition of the board. If that gets triggered, then yes, of course you will require RBI approval. The periodicity does not matter. Deed of covenants would be required whenever you're appointing a director. So if if it is a case of reappointment, then maybe you can take a declaration from the RBI, from the director, that I would abide by the existing deed of covenants. I think that should also suffice the purpose.
Right, right.
In case an NBFC grants a loan against which the shares are kept as security, are provisions relating to loan against security applicable? I just heard the speaker saying otherwise. Okay, so you need to understand, loan against security as a product is a different product in itself. So we often see project loans, or could be any kind of loan or term loans, where the promoters are required to pledge their shares in the company as a collateral security. Now, for example, let's take an example of a project loan. In infrastructure projects, it's very common that we see the promoters we see the banks or financial institutions seeking the promoters to asking for pledge of shares by the promoters. Now we are looking at the potential of the project and not merely the value of the shares. The value of the shares simply acts as a collateral. So it is not principally a loan against shares. But if the whole intention was to so I'm giving the loan to acquire shares, if the intention was to give the loan to acquire those shares, then that would be a case of loan against securities. So therefore a mere collateral is not a loan against share. That is what our understanding and our view has been. This has been a consistent view. If it is just acting as a collateral, then it is not a loan against shares. Only when I'm actually giving the loan, so instead of carrying out a credit underwriting, I am looking at the value of the shares. For example, in a lab, what happens in a lab? We look at the value of the property and then give a loan. Even if the credit worthiness of the borrower is not that great, but if I have a strong collateral, I can still think of giving a loan. So primarily I'm relying on the value of the collateral and not the credit worthiness of the borrower itself. So if such is the case, if I'm looking simply at the value of the shares and then giving the loan, then yes, it would we can still call it as loan against securities. Otherwise, just merely giving it as a collateral does not make it a loan against security. Okay. Can we get a presentation? Yes, you will. What should be the quorum and minimum number of members required for ALCO and RMC, as it is not mentioned in the circular, and the time period within which the meeting to be convened? So yes, you are absolutely correct. There is no, as such, there is no quorum or the minimum number of directors who have been prescribed in the directions. But yes, we have to take a reasonable call. They have stated what should be the profile of people who should be in the committee. And say for example, a risk management committee, I can take a hypothetical example. A risk management, in a risk management committee, what kind of people are we looking at? Someone, members of the board, yes. Members of with normal financial understanding, yes. Senior management personnel looking into the risks of a particular risk management of an entity, answer is yes. So yes, so depending on, I will have to take reasonable call and say that what kind of people I want in the committee, and based on that the composition should be derived. There is no
also
quorum
to
as
add
such.
over here one more thing, the risk management committee, as per the RBI requirement, it says that it should constitute of the CEO or MD and the heads of various risk verticals who are responsible for evaluating the overall risk faced by the NBFC. So these must be a part, they must be a part of the risk management committee. For ALCO also, the composition is mentioned that the NBFC's top management is responsible for ensuring that the risk tolerance limits set by the board are they're implemented. The CEO, MD, executive director, all of them should be a part of. Actually, the CEO or MD must be heading this committee, and the chief of investment, resource management. So it's all the composition. The composition who all should be there is mentioned over there. Apart from that, additionally, also if you require anyone to be a member of that committee, that can be done.
So it is up to the company. It is up to the company. Yeah. One can take a reasonable call and decide what should be the composition of the committees. For a credit card issuing NBFC, is CRILC applicable? Do we need to take credit limit of cardholders as 5 crore exposure? Currently we don't. If Anita, if you have a clear answer to this, then please go ahead. Otherwise, I'll have to check and come back.
No, so for CRILC reporting, there is no such exemption on credit card exposures, because it says that it is both fund-based and non-fund-based exposure that has to be reported. So I don't recall that if there is any exemption for credit card exposures that the company is taking. However, maybe we can check specifically for this if credit card is included or not. Prima facie, I don't think that there is any exemption. It should be covered under CRILC reporting as well.
Right. So there is one more question. Corporate governance norm says that for audit committee, independent directors to be appointed in case of private limited company, which is an NBFC SI. How to comply with this provision? So normally, of course, the moment I bring in independent directors to the board or of a private company, the private company no more remains a private. So we need to also respect the constitution of the company. And based on that, we'll have to take a call. We can, if we want, we can decide not to induct independent directors of the into the audit committee, and that is the very fact that the company is a private company, and in the very first place, it is not required to appoint independent directors, is a sufficient justification. If RBI comes and asks questions this action, then of course that is a sufficient justification to this, that the company is a private company. And being a private company, there is no question of appointing an independent director. So we are okay even if you don't appoint independent directors. But we would suggest that to the extent possible, if we can stretch ourselves to comply with the regulations, then we would certainly recommend that. In case an NBFC grants loan, that this I think we have already answered. Where restructuring norms are covered. There is a separate annexure to the directions. If you are asking about the location of the restructuring norms, then there is a separate annexure to the guidelines. You can refer to that. When we mention total assets of all NBFCs in the group to be taken to calculate, even if it does for one, won't this anyway? Absolutely. So for example, if there is one large NBFC in a group and there are several smaller NBFCs, then that by virtue of the presence of that large NBFC, the smaller NBFCs will also become systemically important company. This is absolutely right. You said no financial distress and no restructuring. Can you provide brief of on financial distress, and if you can charge interest percent, do company need to prove that there is no financial distress? The answer is yes. So for example, let's take the case of this COVID-19. Several of the companies have provided moratorium, or some are going a step ahead and providing extended moratorium or reducing interest rates. So in that case, what is happening is, I am implementing the policy for all the customers on board. This is not a specific relief that I'm providing to a particular customer. So the moment the relief is specific to a particular customer, it has to be treated as a case of restructuring. If it is offered to all the customers on the board and only few of them opt in, that does not defy the very principle that it is not it is not a generic relief that I'm providing to all the customers, and those who are specifically opted in, they have a financial distress. So that is not the case. If it is offered to all the customers at large, then it is not a case of restructuring. However, if it is offered to only a particular customer who is showing signs of distress, so what should be signs of distress? Say for example, the account is already an SMA. The account is already an SMA, or for example, there are indications that there is some problem in the promoter group. So we will have to smell it. We'll have to smell the situation and see if there is any stress in this account. And considering the stress, if I go ahead and extend relief to the customer, then it will be a case of restructuring. Private companies can handle this. The prior approval to be taken in case of change in shareholding, not in buyback, but in other cases of restructuring like consolidation. So if it is a case of merger or consolidation, usually automatically the application is referred to the RBI, and that anyway comes under the scrutiny of RBI. So that anyway,
but it is not a prior approval, it is a sort of an NOC that we obtain from
and
the
also
RBI.
Would depend on what the restructuring would result into, whether that would lead to 30% change in composition of 30% change in the board, or that would lead to change in control. So it is a very circumstantial question. We'll have to see the facts and then come back. In case of IT strategy committee, there is a requirement for appointing the independent director as the chairman of the committee. How to comply with it if it is a private company?
As mentioned, for private companies, I think independent directors are not appointed.
So any executive director, in that case, yeah, we will have to go ahead with any executive director. So for the time being, we would park the questions here. If there are further questions, we will like to take it up at the end of the session. But in the meanwhile, let us now go ahead and with the second part of the session. Right. Now, so in this part, basically, we are intending to cover two recent changes. One was the RBI circular dated 13th March, which was on Ind AS, and the other one was the COVID-19 relief package. So I'll start with the 13th March circular first. So this was a much needed circular, and NBFCs, several of the NBFCs have been complying with Ind AS since last year. And so almost a huge chunk of NBFCs had to prepare their first financials as per Ind AS without any proper guidance from RBI. So of course, RBI also took a substantial amount of time to study the impact, the potential impact of Ind AS on financials of NBFCs. And finally, we have something at least in place, though it does not address all the concerns or all the shortcomings or all the conflicts between Ind AS and RBI regulations, but it certainly is a good start for us. So two major areas where RBI has thrown some light is, number one, capital adequacy, and second is asset classification and provisioning. So I'll start with capital adequacy. Capital adequacy, we just spoke some time back. Anita spoke about it, that any NBFC, systemically important NBFC, has to maintain a capital CRAR of 15%, and of which tier 1 represents 10%, and the remaining tier 2 fills up the remaining. Now, capital so we have also seen the what are the different components of tier 1 and tier 2, and now after Ind AS we need to understand that there could be a situation where the company would earn unrealized gain or would report unrealized gains or unrealized losses. Now what should be the treatment of those unrealized gains or losses while we compute capital adequacy? So this particular circular states that if the company, if by virtue of fair valuation accounting, the company earns any unrealized gain, then that unrealized gain will have to be disregarded while computing the capital of the company. Or so let me give you an example. So say for example, we are considering an instrument which is recorded at fair value through profit and loss. Now in a particular year, we have booked a, so basically we have marked the mark to market the security, and we have booked a gain. Now this gain will sit in my PL, therefore my profit would reflect an unrealized gain. So the moment we take it to when we take it for tier 1 purpose, we will have to deduct this unrealized gain, and then the remainder will be considered for tier 1 capital. Similarly, but it says that if there are unrealized losses, unrealized gains you will have to disregard, but if there are unrealized losses, you will have to consider that. So that is normal principle of conservatism that is applied world across. So if I can foresee a loss, then I should factor for it. But if there is a foreseeable income, then I should wait for it to actually to realize. So therefore, if there are unrealized gains, we disregard them. If there are unrealized losses, we add them. Now we have seen that while computing tier 1, we often disregard my investments in group companies to the extent it exceeds 10%, and then arrive at the tier 1 capital. So for this particular purpose, the RBI has said that you need to, so whatever investments or whatever financial assets you have, you need to segregate them into two parts. First part would deal with or category A, I call it category A, represents investment in group companies and NBFCs which are required to be reduced from tier 1 capital, and any other financial asset apart from category A is category B. So while computing or while considering gains and losses, any net set off. So for example, within category A, there are two assets. One of them shows an unrealized gain and one of them shows an unrealized loss. So we can net settle them, and then whatever the aggregate amount is, if it is an unrealized gain, we will disregard it, and if it is an unrealized loss, then we will take it. For others, same logic applies for others. However, if there are net gains or losses from category A and category B, we cannot mutually offset them. They will have to be treated separately, right? Now, as we noted earlier, that as we just spoke, that any unrealized gains will have to be disregarded. So, but from financials point of view, taking the very example of that instrument where we have booked a mark-to-market gain in a particular year, we have booked a gain. That's why the value of the asset is shown at fair value, which is much higher than the acquisition cost. So does that mean that we will have to provide risk weight on that higher cost? The answer is no, because in the first place you have disregarded the unrealized gain. So therefore, if you have not included that in the numerator, then you cannot include that in the denominator as well. That's why it says that for fair valued instruments, risk weighting should be done on the lower of the following: the acquisition cost or the fair value. So whichever is low. So for example, if the fair value is lower than the acquisition cost, then therefore it shows that there has been an unrealized gain, which we have anyways taken care of while computing the tier 1. But if the fair value is greater than acquisition cost, then that signifies that there is an unrealized gain. Since we have already disregarded it while computing tier 1 capital, we will consider the lower of the two, which is the acquisition cost in the present case, and provide risk weight on that. Similarly, for any gain on fair valuation of property, plant and equipment as on the date of transition, we will see that we have seen that at the time of transition, the property, plant and equipment also has to be fair valued. So every asset has to be booked, brought on the index books on its fair value. So if there is a gain on fair valuation of property, plant and equipment, here we are not disregarding it. See, the question of disregarding unrealized gains arises only in case of financial asset and not on non-financial assets. If it is a case of property, plant and equipment and there is a gain on fair valuation, then it has to be considered at a discount of 55% and it will form part of your tier 2 capital. Now this is not something new. The earlier, before Ind AS also, tier 2 capital included revaluation reserves at a discount of 55%. So this is same as before, and they're just extending the logic over here. Expected credit losses. We will discuss what expected credit losses are. So what exactly is an expected credit loss? So earlier, banks and financial institutions in India used to follow something called the incurred credit loss model. So whenever there was a loss incurred by the entity, one had to provide for it. That's why there was a question of first classifying the entity account into substandard, doubtful, or loss, and based on that, compute provisions on that. But now the Ind AS, as per IFRS or Ind AS, the provisions will have to be calculated on an expected credit losses basis. So I'll have to preempt that whether the particular account will fail or not. Based on this presumption, we categorize the accounts into 3 buckets: stage 1, stage 2, and stage 3. So what is the basis of this presumption? That is the credit risk. So if there is a significant increase in credit risk of the asset on the reporting date. So say for example, the reporting date is 31st March 2020, and if there is a significant increase in credit risk as on 31st March 2020, as compared to what? As compared to the beginning of the financial year, that is 1st April 2019. So on 1st April 2019, say the credit score of a particular asset was 600 or 700, but as on 31st March 2020, we saw that there's been a decline in the credit score and it is somewhere around 550. Now this is a significant decrease in the significant increase in credit. This would release, result in a significant increase in credit risk. So in that case, if it has not defaulted so far, it has to be treated as a case of stage 2. There are other significant indicators as well, where the amount has remained past due for 60 days. It is deemed that there is a significant increase in credit risk. So these are rebuttable presumptions provided in the Ind AS. One can also provide a rebuttable assumption and divert from this particular assumption. But these are the basic parameters which have been laid down in the Ind AS 109 with respect to classification of stage 1, stage 2, and stage 3. Stage 3 is when there is actually a default. So in stage 1 and stage 2, there has not been a default so far. Stage 3, there has been a default. Default means an NPA. That is a case of default. The moment it becomes an NPA, it becomes a default. So until then, we will classify it into stage 1 and stage 2. In stage 1, we compute 12 months expected credit losses, and in stage 2 and 3, we compute lifetime credit losses. RBI says that stage 1 provision, stage 1 expected credit losses can be added as a part of tier 2 capital, because earlier also, if you recall, there was a provision that allowed inclusion of general loss provision to the extent of 1.25% of the risk-weighted assets as a part of my tier 2. So stage 1 ECL is considered as general loss provision, and it is allowed to be added to tier 2 capital, and stage 2 and stage 3 have been disregarded from inclusion into tier 1 or tier 2. But the problem here is in stage 3, so there is a very thin line of difference in stage 2 and stage 3 cases. In stage 3 cases, we show the amount net of the ECL. So if the carrying cost of the asset was say 100 rupees and the ECL computed was 20 rupees, I'll have to show it at a net of 80 rupees. That is what the Ind AS says. However, if in stage 2, it is still shown as 100, but 20 rupees is booked in my PL. So RBI says, since you have disregarded stage 2 from the computation of tier 2 capital, you can also exclude this from the value of the asset and provide risk weight on the rest of it. So therefore, even in stage 2 cases, we will have to provide risk weight on 80 rupees and not on the entire 100 rupees. Securitization transactions, there has been a huge departure from what we used to follow under the earlier directions and what India says. Under the earlier earlier guidelines, if the receivables qualified as true sale, if the transaction qualified as a true sale, that itself was sufficient for a accounting derecognition. But under Ind AS lays down elaborate provisions on derecognition of financial assets, and the financial asset can get off the books only if the derecognition criteria is fulfilled. Now, this criteria is so very complex and stringent that most of the transactions that happen in India, by virtue of the added credit enhancements or the credit enhancement provided to the transactions, they fail to qualify for derecognition. Now the question arises that do we have to provide risk weight on the on-balance sheet assets? The answer is no. RBI says if the transaction stays on your books for by virtue of providing credit enhancement, then it need not be provided. So it should be provided 0% risk weight. The asset should be provided 0% risk weight. However, the credit enhancement provided should be knocked off from your capital, 50% from your tier 1 capital and 50% from your tier 2 capital. Until then, so if the credit enhancement is knocked off, then there is no question of risk weighting the assets that stays on your books even after the securitization transaction. In terms of regulatory reportings, limits and disclosures, everything will have to be done as per Ind AS balances, right? So this, when we were discussing this yesterday, and there is a sudden thought that came into our mind that what would be included in tier 1 capital. So we would appreciate that under Ind AS, not only legal equity, but there are several other types of instruments which qualify as equity instruments for the purpose of Ind AS. So for example, let's take an example of a CCD. A CCD is a case of would qualify as a equity instrument for your Ind AS balances. So anything which any obligation or any instrument which does not obligate me to pay cash or repay the amount back at a future date would qualify as a equity instrument for the purpose of Ind AS. So do I have to also consider those kind of instruments while computing tier 1 capital? The answer is yes. If there are equity instruments classified, so if there are instruments which are classified for the purpose of as equity for the purpose of Ind AS, they should be reckoned while computing tier 1 capital. Moving on to the provisioning norms, like I just spoke about ECL, what ECL is all about, and what are the different kinds of ECL. Now RBI has, so though they have given a free hand to the RBI to compute ECL, but they have provided a floor that your provisions cannot be lower than a particular level. What is that particular level? RBI wants you to maintain a memorandum books and compute provisions on the assets as per RBI directions, which means provide for standard, substandard, doubtful and loss depending on the category, and see what is the total amount of provision that comes. If there is a difference between the ECL and the provisions, then it has to be considered. So if the ECL is more than the provisions as per RBI directions, then there is nothing doing. You are providing higher, that is fine. But if the provisions computed as per RBI directions is more than the ECL that you have computed, then you will have to transfer the difference between the two into something called the impairment reserve. Now this is not a charge against profit. You will still be charging ECL on your PL, but after you have computed your PAT, you will have to transfer the difference to the impairment reserve. This is something similar to what we do under 45 IC. That is also an appropriation of profit. This is also an appropriation of profit. But unlike the statutory reserve, this will not be reckoned for your regulatory capital. Neither this can be withdrawn without RBI's approval. So this is something new, and this will apply prospectively, which means if your company has already complied, has already prepared financials as per Ind AS for the last financial year, you don't have to do anything, and you have not done anything as such, then you don't have to do anything for the last year's balance sheet. But prospectively, so for financial statements for the year ended 31st March 2020 onwards, we will have to follow this. Some other actions which have been provided. So this is something we have summarized. What are the actions that one has to take based on this circular? You will have to prepare a model, a policy covering the business models and portfolios. What could be the potential policies? What could be the potential business models that an NBFC can have? It can have basically there are three models. One is hold to collect. That is, I'm holding the assets till maturity, and simply the intention is to collect the cash flows of the instrument. Normally, in case of a loan, that's what we do. Hold and sell. So I'll derive the economic benefits of the asset from partly by holding it till maturity and partly by selling it. So we often see we securitize loan portfolios. So part of it we don't. So for example, I'm into the business of car financing. I usually don't sell the entire book, but I sell a part of my book. So that can so basically I'm holding the assets partly to hold it till maturity and partly to recover the benefits by selling it off. And the third model is sell. So if I'm into daily trading, my intention is to trade in securities or commodities or for that matter derivatives, whatever it is, then that would be treated as sell. So these what are the different models you will apply? What are the different models applicable to different products of the company? That has to be put in a policy. Objectives of managing the portfolio, policy on sales of amortized cost method. So hold model that I said is amortized cost business model. Methodologies for computation of expected credit losses. This is very important. What are the different assumptions behind the probability of default that you have arrived at? And similarly, what are the considerations that goes into while computing the LGD? So these are some technical terms. I think it's better not to foray into it further. So yes, so your board and senior management's responsibility of implementing Ind AS and disclosures, of course, these need to be covered in a policy. This is so this is all about the 13th March circular. I would now ask Anita to quickly run us pass through this moratorium that came. Yeah, so Anita, you can start. We don't have much of time, so you'll have to actually expedite.
Audible?
Yeah, yes, you're audible. Please go ahead.
Yeah, so regarding this moratorium circular that came on March 27th, since we are standing on 17th of May and the moratorium was for 3 months and we are towards the end of the moratorium. So it may not be relevant enough to discuss what exactly was the moratorium provisions and how have we granted the moratorium to our borrowers. What will be important over here to understand maybe the provisioning requirement. I see there's a couple of questions also on the provisioning requirement. So we may just briefly discuss that what exactly was this circular on moratorium. This the basic understanding of the circular was that due to this COVID disruption that faced, RBI had allowed lenders to grant a sort of a moratorium, which is a payment holiday. By moratorium, what I mean is a payment holiday to their borrowers for paying the installments due between 1st of March till 31st of May. So for this period, from 1st March to 31st of May, any installments that are falling due, the payment of that will not be, you will not be required to pay during this period, and this will not be considered as a default for the purpose of asset classification or degrading the quality of your assets. So from a standard, it will not become substandard just because you're not paying. So this is a moratorium that the lender can grant. Let us understand this was a relief that the RBI allowed me to, and it was not a compulsion on me to grant this. The installments that were covered were principal and interest component of an installment, bullet repayments in case of demand and call loans, EMI payment, credit card dues, all of these were covered. Our view has been that any loan product that the NBFC is extending, given that this particular relief is being granted because of the disruption that has been caused. So our view is that it can be extended to all such loan products as well. To what sort of installments will these apply? It is dues payable between 1st March to 31st March. The language of the RBI circular says that it has to be a standard account as on 1st March. By standard account, what do I mean is that it can be into any SMA category, but it should not be a NPA. So 3 months default should not have been done. It can be between 1 to 90 days. So any dues that was payable before 1st March and is classified as standard as on 1st March will also be covered for granting of this relaxation. However, dues that is payable after 31st of March may not be covered by this particular instruction that came on March 27, unless RBI extends this or there is a voluntary relaxation that the NBFC is granting. This is a voluntary relaxation and it is not compulsory. I have to formulate a board approved policy for this, which must have been done. The repayment schedules will get revised due to this. What are the possible ways of revising my repayment schedule? Either I can keep the EMI same and extend the tenure of the loan, or I can extend the tenure of the loan so as to get the so if it is a 3 months moratorium and a due was supposed to be paid on 1st of April, it gets extended by another 3 months. So instead of 1st of April, it will be paid in on 1st June. So my entire tenure of the loan also gets extended by 3 months. The period, the moratorium period will, however, accrue the interest. So though there is a payment holiday that has been granted, I'll still accrue interest for this period of 3 months. So that is the reason this is a decision that the borrower has to take, whether there is a requirement to avail the benefit of this moratorium or not. It is suggested that only in case there is a difficulty, the cash flows are not available or there is difficulty in repayment and this actual disruption, only then this benefit should be availed, because otherwise you are still being charged with the interest for this moratorium period. So the interest will still be computed for this period. Accrual will still happen. There will not be any delayed payment charges, however. Next, coming on to standstill of classification, since my asset was a standard asset or it was into any SMA category, there will be a standstill that it will stop from further degradation. And even if I'm not paying for these 3 months, my classification will remain as it is, and it will the clock will start moving after the expiry of the moratorium. This benefit, however, is not available for an NPA account, which is already classified as an NPA as on 1st of March. So for an NPA, the moratorium as well as asset classification standstill, both these benefits are not available. Modus operandi, we must have framed a policy by now. Most of the NBFCs must have framed a policy, and they must have given this option to the customers to avail the moratorium. It is the RBI intends to grant this benefit to all borrowers across all categories of borrowers, irrespective of the fact that whether they are to all categories, unless the borrower opts to decline. So it has to be given to all the borrowers, unless the borrower says that no, I want to repay my loan as per the existing repayment schedule itself. Next, the provisioning requirements. Another circular that was released by the RBI in April, which talked about the asset standstill, asset classification, and the provisioning norms with respect to these loan cases, assets wherein I had granted moratorium. For such cases, so there over here in this PPT, if you'll see on your screen, we have divided it into 4 categories. So there can be a situation as on 1st March that there was no dues pending, days pending dues. So DPD as on 1st March was 0. So there was no default on the loan, and as till 31st March, I have and there has been a grant of moratorium for 3 months. So whether as on 31st March, the RBI requirement is that a 10% provision has to be created on all such accounts who have availed the benefit of this moratorium and the asset quality has not been degraded. So when I mean that you have availed the benefit of this moratorium so as to put a standstill on the asset classification, what I mean is that if had the moratorium not been granted to you, then you would not the asset must have degraded into an NPA, and you would have required to provide it for as an NPA. So before an asset becomes an NPA, an asset can be SMA 0, 1 or 2. If it is a SMA 0, that is, it is falling between DPT 0 to 30, as on 1st March, if it is 0, on 31st March, it will be 31 days. Whether the provisioning will be required? No, it will not be required, because there is no benefit that is being availed due to the grant of the moratorium. The asset degradation would not have happened to make it a NPA. It could still be a SMA 0 itself. If it is 30 days DPT as on 1st March and it becomes 61 on 31st March, 30 days, Murad, in that case also there will not be any provisioning required. So as on 31st March, I have to create 5% provisioning. The total 10% has been divided into two parts, 5% on 31st March and 5 in the next quarter as on June. So for that also, this provisioning will not be required, since this is a SMA 1 category account. Only in case it is a SMA 2, which is 60% DPT as on 1st March, there will be a downgrade. Had this moratorium not been granted as on 31st March, it would have been classified as a NPA, because DPT would have become 91 days. So in that case, I'm actually availing a benefit of this moratorium and I'm not degrading the quality of the asset. The asset classification has not been downgraded, and due to the moratorium. So since the benefit has been availed, and that is the reason a provisioning will be required over here, and 5% provisioning will be created. For an account which is already 90 days DPT, which is already classified as an NPA, since the the moratorium benefit is also not available and the account is already an NPA, the asset classification standstill benefit also does not apply over here. The 10% provisioning that is usually done for an substandard asset will be required. What will be the position as on 30th June? It will be same for those SMA 1 and 2, for those asset classes which were already SMA 1 and 2 on 1st March. As on June, due to the moratorium, the obligation for the customer to pay has not arisen during this moratorium period till 31st March. So even if the customer was was classified as SMA 0 or 1, the default after till 30th June will start, the clock will start moving only after once the moratorium period gets over. So during the moratorium from 1st to 31st, the classification will not degrade, or I'll not count the number of days for which the payment is remaining due. In case the customer pays in June, the DPT as on 30th June will be 91 days. And so the required over here for a DPT which is classified for an asset which is classified as SMA 1 as on 1st March, for those cases also provisioning of 5% in June will not be required. It is only if my asset was classified as SMA 2 as on 1st March that the customer and the customer pays one installment in June, but as on 1st March he had the obligation to pay for 2 months. So the obligation on 1st March will become as on 30th June, the obligation of 60 days, another 30 days will be, another 60 days will be added to it. It will become 120 days, and hence it will require a provisioning of 5% as of June. For NP again, these will not be covered under this, and the usual NPA classification and provisioning will be followed for these accounts. I think this will be it for the provisioning requirement. However, I think there were certain questions with respect to the provisioning requirement. So if we can just...
Yeah, so there is a question from Abhishek Yadav. In case moratorium is granted, to a borrower and the provisioning of 10% is made. Subsequently, the borrower repays the entire amount. Can it be written back instead of maintaining till the end of? No, it cannot be written back. So only thing that it says is that you can either, if there are actual provisions created, then you can adjust it against this general loss provision, or you will have to wait till the end of the financial year to roll it back. So you have to wait till the end of financial year. Is this general provision in addition to normal provision? The answer is yes. This is an additional provision.
Yes.
This will be, there is one more question regarding provision. RBI circular speaks only on, no, okay, just a moment. This is in addition, and also one more point is that this will also be covered also. So we can consider this as a part of tier 2 capital as well. So tier 2
Yes.
capital, it says that it includes general loss provision. So this is a bit different from the normal ECL that we compute or normal provisions that we create. They are not; these are not specifically attributable to particular asset. This we will have to do it at a bucket-wise provisioning will have to be created. So since these are not specific to particular assets, and these have been done in accordance with a special direction issued in this regard, so we can, as per our understanding, we can include this as a part of tier 2 capital. So the only difference that it would create is that since this will be a charge against profit, so this amount will go out from your tier 1 capital, but it will come back on your tier 2 capital. But so therefore, if your company has a weak tier 1 or inadequate tier 1, then this will be a concern for you. But if you have a substantially strong tier 1 capital, then this won't affect your capital in any manner whatsoever. RBI circular speaks on only term loans and working capital loans. Can the same benefits be extended to loans against shares? The answer is yes, because a loan against shares is also a term loan, and it is extended. Doesn't matter whether it's a bullet prepayment loan or a amortizing loan. Doesn't matter. If it is a term loan, then yes, moratorium can be extended. There is one more question. Change in management of more than 30% announcement needs to be made in newspaper, with the mere change of nominee director resulting in change in more than 30% director, whether such announcement is required to be made. So see, first you will have to apply for an approval to the RBI, and subsequently if RBI gives an approval, only then you go for a public notice. Now, at several instances, we have seen where RBI has taken a lenient view.
Just one thing to add over here. A public notice may not be required in case it is a change in management, because there is a confusion over here, because the heading says that there is a requirement, the heading to that para which deals about public notice, it says that there is a requirement of public notice in case there is a change in control or management. However, if you see the provisions, it is only required in case there is a transfer of control or change in ownership of shares.
So no, I think there are some RBI offices. There are some RBI offices who actually insist on a public notice even for a change in management. So if at all you fall under such a jurisdiction, then you take it to the RBI, and it is most logical that how would a nominee director change in nominee director require a public notice? So you can represent your case in front of RBI, and they can take a lenient view and grant a specific exemption. Right. So are there any other questions? Right. So I don't think there are any other questions. We are already 15 minutes past the scheduled time. So thank you for staying with us during this session. And whatever I think we have been able to give you an bird's eye view of the regulatory framework of systemically important NBFCs, and also delve upon certain. Okay, there are some more questions. Just a moment. Is there any specific circular for framing policy with respect to housing finance company? Housing finance companies are currently, though they are being regulated by RBI, but they are currently following the directions laid down by National Housing Bank. RBI was supposed to come out with a regulatory framework for housing finance companies by 31st March 2020. However, due to other, of course, for obvious reasons, due to this COVID and other regulatory work, they have not been able to come out with their specific regulations for housing finance companies. So unless there is a specific guidelines issued by RBI, it will continue to follow the guidelines laid down by NHB. Right. So with that, I would thank you all for coming, sparing 2 hours on a Sunday, and staying with us throughout the session. My colleagues will get in touch with you. So we'll share the PPT with you separately after the session, and also they would share a feedback form with you. So please do share your honest feedback, so that it gives us a motivation to improve ourselves in our subsequent webinars. We are also planning some more webinars on this particular topic, more on financial instruments and Ind AS and RBI regulations put together. So we are currently structuring one such session. So we would certainly want you all to be a part of that, because this is certainly moving into industry time. It is a very important thing to stay updated. So with that, thank you all for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.